The thing that I like about the film is that it focuses on a presentation of Paul the man. Right. For a number of years, I've toyed with the idea of a book on Paul, but then keep telling myself, do we need yet another book on Paul? But the book that I've never found the courage to write would be entitled Paul the Man, the Mission, and the Message. And one of the emphases that I think is often missing in a lot of scholarly books on Paul is the human factor. And I think the film does a terrific job of portraying a rendition. It is an artistic rendition. So as with any artistic portrait, it's highly interpretive, and there is artistic freedom taken. And at any given point, or a number of points, I and other people might say, I'm not sure about that date, or I'm not sure about that specific, whatever. But collectively or cumulatively, the thing that I like about the film, and I think would make it very useful in churches especially, and with the general public, is that it presents a human Paul. And I think, it seems to me, I don't know how Rob intended it, but it comes over to me as a very, very much a sympathetic presentation of the man. I think churches are not accustomed to thinking of Paul as a human being, but as an apostle, whatever that would be. And I think that the general public has received a lot of bad press about Paul, so that they think of him as being a total ogre and almost anti-human thing. So that this presents, I think, a viscerally human figure who is capable of suffering, capable of disappointment. Whether he died in deep disappointment, as some of the scholars think at the end or not, can be debated. But certainly it succeeds in presenting a particular take on a very human and viscerally human Paul.
The framework I use, because there are these different ways to construct a narrative, was classical narrative. So what I looked for was more like human motives to explain what chronology might be, resolve of conflict, a nemesis that kind of piques Paul's weakness in the story. This reconstruction is what makes it so unique to the academic world, is that very few try to organize it along with the classic idea of narrative, with the ebb and flows of narrative, where there is some play, but you're dealing more with universals in a broader term. So let me just step back a second. So I would say for the audiences that are more academic, most of them would agree I'm dealing with the critical facts on the ground in my own way, in my own subjective attempt to do this. But once I go outside of the academic community, you have to realize 90% of the people I speak with don't even understand what I'm talking about. They don't even understand the critical facts from 1 to how many books are in the Bible and why Paul this. And so when I'm coming at this with architectonic hopes of even raising the broadest ideas here, that there was conflict at all, that there was a struggle for Jewish identity inside of Christianity, that there was a collection. So for me, I'm going to just pull back out of the academic world and push back a little bit here and say, from my perspective, and I walk through a lot of different audiences, I'm still going for the 90% and saying I would be glad that they told me I sequenced this incorrectly, but knew all the facts to tell me why it was sequenced incorrectly.
Most scholarly books on Paul, on his theology, on his biography, and so on. I've over the years, it's been a hobby of mine to sort of go to the index of Pauline books and look for collection, Jerusalem, or whatever. And the number of books in which it just does not appear in the index at all. You would never know that Paul engaged in such a thing. Whereas it seems to me that one of the things that I think the movie does right, although I have my own particular problems with artistic liberties at certain points, but absolutely it seems to me the collection for Jerusalem was a major project for Paul. I think Joachim Jeremias once suggested that it may have occupied as much as 7 years of his ministry. So, and certainly the final text in that you reiterate, and I think rightly, several times in Romans, is that when Paul is preparing to go to Jerusalem to deliver it, that passage that you cite from Romans is, I think, undeniably full of anxiety about what the hell is going to happen when he gets there. So I think that is a, whatever quibbles one may have, and I do have mine with individual things. This is one of the great things about the movie, that for teaching purposes and I think for the general public, it makes it clear that this Jerusalem offering, I think, was a major feature of Paul's ministry. He invested a hell of a lot into it. Yeah. You can't read 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and fail to see that. And also that it was intended in some kind of way, under some circumstances, to secure, maintain, whatever, a mutual relationship recognition between the Pauline mission and the Jerusalem church.
And I wouldn't disagree with what Larry just said. I think it was important, and Paul saw it as a way of doing a better job of further cementing a rather fragile unity that there was amongst the real leaders of the movement. And so he had great hopes that would accomplish that. Now, when he got there, neither Acts nor Paul's letters say that it failed. There's silence in both cases. So the question is, how do you read the silence, right? You could read it like Dom Crossan did in the film and say, well, maybe they accepted it, but they said, use this for supporting the Nazaritic vows, which is exactly what Acts says, right? So is it going to actually accomplish what Paul wanted, a better cementing of the core leadership of the early Christian movement? Well, it probably didn't accomplish that. It may have been accepted, but it was used for a lesser purpose than Paul hoped for. To me, one of the most telling lines in the movie about the collection is that after Paul is taken prisoner and is taken to Caesarea Maritima for 2 years, he's under house arrest, no one from the Jerusalem church comes to his defense. And A.J. Levine was the one who pointed this out. Now that, I think, is very telling. I think that absence or silence in both Paul's letters and in Acts is very telling. And it tells us that what did not happen is all that Paul had hoped the collection would accomplish.
The way I'm looking at it is not, can I win over the approval of scholars potentially debating how well I sequenced or not? What I'm saying is most of the Christian world knows nothing about the Bible, largely nothing other than the devotional approach, which is pick out what you want, and the mythical approach. Can't debate it, don't know the facts, whatever. So I'm saying, just to drive the spearhead home again, if most people knew that in the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul is accused by fellow Jewish apostles that he's embezzling money to win over the support and honor of the apostles in Jerusalem, that alone, that fact alone, if most people knew that, I would treat the whole approach to this differently. But that's one of maybe 12 or 15 undeniable facts of Scripture that point all toward conflict, an ironing out of movements early, who has the authority, who doesn't. That to me, frankly, and that's why I wrote a book, by the way, because I try and defend the arguments in the book in a way you can't in the narrative. But I'll push back again on the idea that because you can find in the 30, let's say even 50% of the problems academically on the sequencing, it would then make meaningless the points themselves. And I think it's also the approach. A narrative approach tries to collect things in a sequence that tells a good story so that the humanity is born of it. I think academics is more like archaeology. You spend so much time on the find and digging it, it's hard for you to relate it to others because you may not know exactly that you get kind of stuck. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong here. I'm just saying it's hard to know. But when you see it from a point of sequence, again, I don't think most people don't believe there was any disagreement between James and Paul. They don't believe that there was an ethnic conflict at the core of Christianity and Jewish identity. Most people don't know this.
On points about, for example, the relationship of Paul to Jerusalem, I don't find anything in the film that you can't find some current scholar asserting.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it isn't as though it's plucking things out of the stratosphere. There are people, I think, for the most part, who are there's a talking head or two or three somewhere here who says pretty much every damn thing that's said in the film. Not a single person saying everything, but everything in the film it seems to me is backed up by one or two or three at least talking heads somewhere.
That was my rule for the way it was three. For each truth,
at the mouth of two or three witnesses, right?
That's why I said always three. If I was going to put it in the film, and someone I could use as
so
backup.
it's not it's not completely off the record. So I think, to be fair, that Rob has chosen to put together in a particular combination scholarly views. Somebody else might put together a differing mixture of scholarly views. Sure. I probably would at certain points, but the particular mixture that you see here is not bizarre. It's debatable.
Well,
but it's
I
not
was
bizarre.
I was waiting to get a chance here, but James Dunn, I think, would suggest I didn't go far enough with the relationship with James, and so would Ralph Martin. And if you read his commentary on James, I didn't go far enough. So even after the film, you could argue mainstream scholars, respected scholars, would say I didn't go far enough, that they use words like he was invited into an ambush, left to soak in his own juices. And so this is not something I'm creating as a filmmaker. I might be choosing what I want to support my film, but I'm not, like you said, plucking this out of the air, and I go on in each case. So again, if you take a step back and say, what am I saying? We would need more time. What am I actually saying that wouldn't be accepted by some corner of mainstream critical scholarship? I don't think there's anything in there. I think you could make a case for the sequencing for sure, and where I fill in the blanks, but again, I think I could find 3 witnesses for most of the points I'm making.
I don't think you could find 3 witnesses for the end of the story the way you end the story. I really don't. For example, what we are told happens to Paul in the temple is, yes, there's a mob, and yes, there's some pushing and shoving. And then when Paul is requisitioned by the Roman centurion, he stands on the steps of the temple and gives a speech giving his testimony about his life. He doesn't go into unconsciousness. He's not beaten to a pulp. He's not lying on the floor of the temple beaten. None of that, right? Now,
It makes better television.
It makes way better television. It's full of pathos, but it's not in any text. Yeah, it's very effective, but it's not in Paul and it's not in Acts.
But what I did is I actually cited, a bit of a classicist myself, and there's an author called Dando Collins who's an expert in the Roman army, and I spent a lot of time in his works. And it is circumstantial, but when you go back to who was stationed at the time, who was called on that came to rescue Paul, what would that look like? What would the circumstances look like? How would they rescue? What would a mob do to a person? I mean, if I allowed Acts to interpret, I think the tone of that mote, you're right. But I would go to circumstances. Well, to me, Acts is always trying to favor unity in a tone of optimism and hope. So would he want to get into the level of detail that would be more realistic? I don't think there would be any other type of mob except for brutal, bleeding mobs when you're mobbing to tear someone apart. As a matter of fact, some historians have pointed to the fact that he was pulled out of the temple because they didn't want to spill his blood in the temple, because it would have been sacrilegious to spill his blood in the temple. So this is a bloody mess. This is fanaticism and a bloody mess, and people willing to kill for their faith and belief. I just want to be clear about this again. This is the historical versus the theological. How people determine theology and reinterpret experiences from history is a different trajectory than going back in history and saying a mob attacked someone in the temple and what that looked like. I don't think it was polite. I do think the Bible and the circumstantial evidence and the history points to the fact that Paul, you could use the word yourself, fill in the blank, expands, brings new revelation, extends, whatever you want to say, to a point that if you're talking about the institutional church, the physical religion, I think you can make the case that he can be a founder, the main founder or whatever, but it's about how you interpret the handing over of Jesus, his immediate followers, and then Paul.
Yeah, I think I forget the guy's name. I'm embarrassed to say at the moment, but he has the category of what he calls a minor founder figure. It's a sociologist of religion whose name escapes me at the moment, and Paul is, I think, is his principal candidate, which it seems to me is a valid category. Paul does describe himself as being given a revelation, and he does describe the gospel to go to enfranchise the Gentiles as a new revelation and a new calling. So I don't think Paul says that I got this from Jesus of Nazareth. He gets it from the glorified Jesus, the post-resurrection Jesus in his experience. And the Gospels, it seems to me, present Jesus as pursuing a ministry to fellow Jews to prepare them for the coming kingdom of God. And Paul's ministry is, yeah, that's well and good. I've been given a ministry to declare the eschatological moment predicted in Zechariah, predicted in Isaiah, the moment when the nations will come to God as nations without becoming Jews. And that time has come, and I've been chosen to say that moment has arrived. So, of course, Jesus, didn't authorize or conduct a ministry to the Gentiles, and Paul never says anything else. It seems to me he's saying, no, that was my job.
But at the same time, when they have this agreement that Peter's going to be the apostle to the Jews and Paul's going to be the apostle to the Gentiles, they don't have two different gospel messages. No. And if we really want to talk about what could they have been talking about for 15 days and it wasn't the weather when he went and talked to Peter, they would be talking about the real basis of what the proclamation was, the theological substance of it. And they would have easily been able to agree that what was said about Abraham was that eventually this tradition was to be a light to the nations. And they would have been in agreement with that. But it was for the Jew first. And Paul is emphatic in Romans. It's for the Jew first and also for the Gentiles, right? So, I mean, even if they had just discussed the Abrahamic tradition, what are the implications about Jews being the light to the non-Jewish nations? I think they would have agreed. The question is, what's the basis of a Gentile mission? Is it going to be no circumcision and no kosher and no Sabbatarian, or is it going to be something else, But I don't think there would have been any disagreement about there being a Gentile mission.
Is it possible that the Gentile mission, because of the circumstances on the ground, might have forced some of the Jerusalem apostles to recoil more because it wasn't resulting in the kind of mission they thought originally started, which is the point of view of the film, which was, I thought, what I took from the scholars was that's the beauty of the narrative versus the archaeological find, that when you set up the narrative, you go, it's possible James could have recoiled back. That's my point of view. He might have been on board, but given this and the apocalypse, not the fulfillment of the apocalypse.
Yeah, I think a number of scholars have proposed
Sure.
that under the impact of rising tensions in Judea, and we think we know from Josephus and so on in particular, that from sometime around perhaps 40 AD or so, you begin to see a progressive kind of what in hindsight is a kind of growing drumbeat of tension, difficulty. By the time you get into around 60 or so, it's on the boil. And so a number of scholars, of course, as you will know, a number of scholars have suggested that in those circumstances of a kind of rising tension in Judea, that it became more and more dicey for James and the Jerusalem-based leadership at that time to continue to approve the kind of Gentile mission that Paul is doing, and a great deal of pressure not to do so. Plus, as Acts indicates, even let me come to the defense of Acts for a moment. As even Acts indicates in its representation of Paul's final visit, the author puts in the mouth of James the statement, "Brother Paul, you see how many there are in the Jerusalem church here who are devout observers of Torah, and they have heard some very nasty things about you." Right. So you have not only this kind of politically difficult circumstance that I think James would have had to have felt the heat for continuing to approve this guy and the Gentile mission, particularly when you have these rumors that Acts itself echoes, which I think is probably authentic, probably the sort of things that were being said about Paul. And so I do think that there would have been real tensions there and uncertainty on the part of James as to how to move. Peter, I'm not so sure of, because it seems to me precisely the fact that James has become the leader in the Jerusalem church. I, with some other people at least, some of the people I drink with, think that that Peter at this point has himself begun to engage in a kind of translocal ministry and is no longer a kind of Jerusalem caliph. That it's James who's become a kind of the Jerusalem caliph, and Peter is out there in the diaspora, Jewish diaspora at least. But very real tensions, very real difficulties. As I say, even in what James is portrayed as saying to Paul in the Acts account. The one place that you didn't mention, by the way, just a little footnote here, scholarly quibble, but the one place that you didn't mention, when you say Acts makes no reference to the Jerusalem collection, the one intriguing possibility is in Paul's second speech, is it, to one of the Roman governors? Yeah. I think it's not.
Acts 24:17.
Yeah, and now at last I have come back bearing alms for my people.
Why is Paul in so much danger when he comes to the temple, yet James worships at the temple?
Because James is Torah true. James is an observant Jew, and Paul is no longer an observant Jew.
And what about the Messiah part of it? What about the Jesus as Messiah? So in other words,
I don't think that's an issue.
Well, let's keep going here. So let's say this is I'm offering this as a possibility. So if James believes in the Messiah, correct, in the same way Paul does, does he not believe in Paul's vision of what the Messiah's revelation was, which was that it was a new epoch and the idea of the Jewish law was something of the past and had faded away, no longer Jew or Greek, or not? Was he not that far on board?
Here's what I would say about that. I think you have three positions. You have the Pharisaic Jewish Christians in the Jerusalem church that think everybody has to become Jews and become Torah true to be followers of Jesus. That's pile A. Pile B is James, who is not there, but he may well have thought that all the Jewish Christians should probably be observant, at least if they're in the Holy Land and in the Jerusalem church and that sort of thing, because of the witness to the Jews. I mean, go back and read Acts 15. What does it say? Because we're concerned about the witness to the Jews, we're writing this decree, this letter, and asking the Gentiles to accept these compromises so that it will not compromise the witness that we have to other Jews who are not yet followers of Jesus, right? This is James's overall concern, the witness to the Jews, and I think that's right. I mean, it's an apologetic concern. But over here you have Paul, and Paul's view is we're no longer under the Mosaic covenant. The new covenant is not a renewal of the Mosaic covenant. It's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, and you have his fellow Pauline workers like Timothy and like Titus and probably Apollos and others who agree with that, right? So you have three rather distinct opinions on how this movement should go forward. Now, as it happens, pile three, the balance of history tells us they, in the end, mostly won the day. That's what history tells us, right? But I don't think that James and Paul had some fundamental Christological difference. I think it's praxis. The issue is praxis between them.
So
Can I-
one other question, and then please. So then the question is: so when Paul is rebuking his fellow apostles, is preaching a false gospel or another gospel in Galatians, what is he referring to? The other? He's not saying a different gospel. He's saying a false or another gospel, one that if it even came from angels, you should not listen to it. What is that gospel?
It's the gospel of the Judaizers. It's
Which
not
is
the
what?
gospel of James. The gospel of the Judaizers is that all God's children's got to become Jews and follow the gospel according to Moses in regard to circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and food laws if they're going to be followers of Jesus. That's the false gospel.
So you're saying there's a middle road between, and that's
Exactly.
James.
Exactly.
I guess I would have to, I think, from what I heard, maybe just to illustrate how people can be, I think I would probably have to disassociate myself a bit from maybe both of my other panelists here on this issue. I don't see clear evidence that Paul taught that the Torah was annulled and canceled.
No, I think he'd say it was fulfilled. The Mosaic
well,
covenant was
but
fulfilled in Christ.
I'll put it positively. I line myself up with those who say that Paul believed that Jewish believers in Jesus should continue to circumcise their sons and should continue to observe Torah so long as it didn't prevent them from accepting Gentiles as full co-religionists. And that Paul's message is, and as I understand him at least, until I'm helped to see otherwise, all of the passages in Paul's letters where he is critical of Torah are contexts, it seems to me, where somebody's trying to make Gentiles observe Torah, and that's the issue. But I think he has no problem with Jews continuing to be Jews. And I will point out, although it's in Acts, is the Paul of Acts circumcises Timothy.
Sure he does.
Because he's a Jew. So in answer to the famous question, the question that Dom Crossan asks in his book on early Christianity, where he spends 10 or 15 pages saying, I'm not going to deal with Paul because he has nothing to do with the origins of Christianity. He's second generation. Bizarre. Anyway, he says, Paul was a Platonist, so I'm not going to deal with him. And says, so in other words, if Paul had a son, he would not have circumcised him. Now, for what it's worth, I think that's absolutely bonkers. If Paul had a son as a Christian apostle, of course he would have circumcised him because he continued to see himself a Jew. How do I know that? At the very least, because on at least 5 occasions by his own testimony, he's willing to undergo synagogue makot, stripes, 39 lashes, and the only reason you're willing to do that is because you are a Jew, you wish to continue to be considered a Jew. The synagogue in wherever has found you guilty of some serious infraction that requires you to be punished, so you take your punishment, and after you've had your punishment, your membership card's validated. So I think that the issue between Paul and the Judaizers, who are Jewish believers, fellow Jewish believers, from my standpoint, is over whether, in fact, Gentiles coming into the faith need to complete their conversion in addition to baptism by taking up Torah observance on the one side. And on Paul's side, he's saying, hell no. As far as Gentiles are concerned, it is faith in Christ and observing the law of Christ that is their responsibility.
And this will show a disagreement between two people who have a lot of things that they agree on. I think 1 Corinthians 9 absolutely rules that out. Paul says, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To those under the law, not me, I became as one under the law, so I might win some of those who are under the law. Now, no Jew who was Torah true would say that. No Jew who thought he was still obligated to keep the Torah would say that. He's doing it for missionary and apologetic and evangelistic purposes. That's why he's doing it.
Well, we disagree on that, but let's deal with other question.
That was nice to.
This gentleman's question
Yeah.
about the form of the film.
Okay. Well, the first answer is they didn't give me the budget for the sequel to The Passion, so that was one. That was one.
Yeah.
Actors don't come cheap.
No, they don't. Number 2 is I knew that by using the critical scholarship to lead in the new sequencing of a narrative, that you'd be entering in from a theological or biblical perspective a new world. So I thought to eliminate, if you're stepping into a new world and you want people to experience a new world, avoid the old worlds of what the reference point would be, like the bad actor behind the jail cell, and the dropping of the knife in the dust, and kind of those, I think, things that trivialize. I think it's why secular or non-religious people don't take religious films seriously, because they could see no one took the care to give conviction to the choices aesthetically. So, and these are all art panels. They were done 30 or so art panels and layered. It took a lot of work to do that. And they're kind of like neo Caravaggio, if you will, a digital Caravaggio, because I was trying to bring it into the new world and say, just like Caravaggio would have updated the understanding of Christianity for his time, if I brought it into the digital universe, what would that look like? So I was trying to have the aesthetics match the critical scholarship and modernizing of the scholarship.
And for my money, he does a much better job than many of these schlocky productions we get on the Hysterical Channel and the Discovery Channel, etc. This is a much better production than that, and it's much more substantive. Whether you agree or disagree with the substance, it is substantive. It's in your face, and it challenges you on the issue of Paul and the origins of Christianity. And I think it's way better than most anything you could find on any of those cable channels, really. But there were a few places where I thought, no, that came in the context of a sentence where I actually said more, and it was fairly clearly nuanced in a different direction. But for the most part, I'm giving him a passing grade with what he did.
Thank you, sir.
Well, if you carefully note the thing, you'll notice that I come up for about 3.5 seconds early in the film and never again.
He's my ace in the hole.
So I can't complain too much about that. It also has to be said, if Paul's Jerusalem collection occupied 7 years, I think the film occupied at least that much or more like a decade. Mm-hmm. And I think I was one of the first people interviewed 10 years or more ago. And I don't recall actually that I was interviewed on this particular, that I understood at the time that this was the film. It was the Jerusalem collection. I don't know whether my recollection is correct, but my recollection was that I may have brought up the Jerusalem collection because I thought that somebody ought to talk more about it. But maybe that's a misrepresentation. But in any case, I think that this baby grew across the years and achieved more of a kind of definitive shape across the years. So I was in early and so on. But I think I will say that on behalf of the other people who were quoted, that I didn't find anything that they said strange from what I know of their writings. You know, Wright, Fredrickson, Crossan, all of Ludemann, all of the others. It all made perfect sense. And in the case, of course, of Gerd, his own personal experiences of church conflict in Germany, I thought came through very, very much in the way he was. So it all struck me as being fairly representative of what they were trying to say.
I'm not surprised by that.
And if nothing else, you will have realized that Paul was a heavy hitter and a very complex figure. I mean, it was like when John Donne said, "Wheresoever I open the letters of Paul, I hear thunder, a thunder that rolls throughout all the earth." I mean, this was heavy weather, right? When you read Paul's thought and who he was, and I think the film does a good job of showing the complexity and the emotions of Paul, the pathos of Paul as well. I don't think the original disciples fully understood the implications, especially the radical implications of Jesus' teaching about nonviolence and some of these other things, until many years later. And Peter needed an extra revelation to get there on whether he could eat barbecue or not, right? Mm-hmm. He needed an extra revelation. So, I mean, if you look at the disciples in the Gospels, they come across as the disciples. They just often don't get it. And they don't get it until many years later. Well, that's okay. I think what happens with Paul is he got the benefit of coming after the fact, and after it had dawned on James, and after it had dawned on Peter what the story was, and he applies the ethics of Jesus to his churches in various ways. So the attempt to drive a sort of hard wedge between the ministry of Jesus, which was to go to the Jew first, and what Paul is doing, I don't think Paul would have agreed that's at all what he was trying to do.
I would just want to emphasize again, to come back maybe to your analogy, Rob, of narrative. The narrative that is laid down in the New Testament, basically, is a ministry of Jesus of Nazareth to his people, to prepare them for the kingdom of God. Right. And then you have, in the continuing narrative, a death and resurrection. And it is, if I recall correctly, consistently the risen, glorified Jesus who issues a great commission in Matthew, not the Jesus of Galilee, but the Jesus of the risen, glorified Jesus, to whom all authority in heaven and earth has been given, and so on and so on. And in Luke likewise, it is the risen Jesus who orders the disciples to go into all nations. So the New Testament itself, it seems to me, makes a fairly clear distinction between what Jesus was up to, so to speak, in his own ministry, and what God exalts him to be, and the kind of radically widened dimension of what is to happen in the post-Easter period, as we talk about. So to say, Jesus did not foresee a mission to the Gentiles, I think, the Gospels, it seems to me, make that, in my mind, fairly clear. He was not in the business of conducting a Gentile mission. Paul was, and this idea of a Gentile mission and of a kind of proclamation of Jesus as the Lord to whom worship is to be given along with the God of Israel is, it seems to me, a conception that erupts in the consequent upon the conviction that Jesus has been raised from the dead and exalted to heavenly glory and so on. So there's a sense in which, from my standpoint, would Jesus have approved this? It seems to me as a kind of red herring. But it's true. Jesus didn't foresee it and didn't talk about it, and Paul did. So there is this difference. I guess I have a bit of problem with saying, would Jesus have approved? There's a sense in which it seems to me that's kind of irrelevant, because the New Testament never says we're doing this because Jesus of Nazareth commanded us to do so. It's saying we're doing this because God requires us to do so now.
Which goes back to my point about my, as a filmmaker, representing the different propositions, right? If I'm seeing it as a human project, I can't read divine intent into why one thing leads itself into the progressive revelation of another.
About whether God did it or not. I'm just simply saying that Paul and the early Christians, James and so on, don't don't claim that Jesus
okay, so
ordered them
what-
to do this.
so then
they
how would-
claim that they claim that God told them to do it. Did God or not? That's a theological issue. But the historical issue is they didn't claim that they're doing it in obedience to Jesus of Nazareth. They claim they're doing it in obedience.
So
to God's
right. But
command.
for the relevance for this story, so it doesn't broaden too much the conversation, and we got to wrap up. But why is he getting the pushback from the other apostles that are not embracing it in his ministry, in Paul's ministry? And I'm just saying that means that those closest in proximity to Jesus are not in agreement with Paul about what the mission is or what the full gospel is.
Or at least the terms of that mission.
Okay, so that's all I'm saying. That accepting that in consensus, it's plausible to then take one more chess move back, pull the piece back, and say, okay, well then who hears Jesus correctly? That's all I'm saying. If you don't enter theology and you just bring the sequencing of the logic, you say either Paul does via the revelation or Jesus' immediate followers do. And if you say Jesus' immediate followers do, you have to ask the question, was Jesus' intent to go as far as Paul ultimately went with the mission? And I think it's just a fair question, and I left it there. So it wasn't me I didn't want to undermine faith or say there wasn't cases where they supported each other, but that's my job, was to have this conversation, not to tell you what to think. It wasn't a collection for the poor. You could argue it had a byproduct that meant taking care of the poor, but Paul was always in the business of taking care of the poor and raising collections. That goes way back to, I believe, Barnabas and his start way back in Antioch. So this was something else. This was not the same giving to the poor, but I think that he was on board. So now let me add point number 2. Most of them would agree that it was an opportunity to bring unity to the faith. Okay, consensus again. 2, and now most people don't even know this. So as a filmmaker, I'm just trying to bring out. Then I'll go to 3, and I would say that the word for poor, now you'll get diversity, doesn't just mean the money itself, but the group that's asking for the collection. That the poor represents something that goes way back in time. Some argue the Maccabees, it started with the Maccabees, that he might have said, just don't forget the poor, meant those of us waiting in the apocalyptic period in Jerusalem. Take care of us because we need to worship and prepare for that day, that great day the kingdom of God is, and need the collection to support us in Jerusalem. That's, again, you'll get diversity there, but I'd say 2/3 would say some of that is going on. So just that alone, if we could wrap up, maybe you guys could give a final comment on that. Again, I would feel like I did my job because when I, as a filmmaker, come into the arena of scholars and I'm looking at things and no one is talking about this, and I think there clearly would change the way you think about the verses themselves, how they sequence, traditional exegesis. You'd start to say, okay, let's think of the collection differently. 1, it may have taken 7 to 10, 5 years. 2, it had a proponent to it that meant unity. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention honor and obligation. If you accept the collection, you owe something to the other side, which meant you were part of the group. Then go on to say, and it meant the group itself to some level. Now read the verses, now read the actions of Acts, and in those verses, and now think about the same verses, and you go, whoa, that's not just taking care of poor people. It's not handing out, when you go to church, they hand out the collection to get the money in the church. This is much deeper in its significance. And I'd like to wrap up, if you don't mind, your own comments on what I just said, and how that would be valuable or not as a film, or how that film is introduced to the community.
C.H. Dodd a long time ago said, the function of a parable is to tease the mind into active thought. I would say that's what this film does, and it does it very well. Whether you agree or disagree, it asks a lot of the right questions. It provides you with a spectrum of voices, which you usually do not get in these kind of films. And, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it never was going to be. And is it interpretive? It was always going to be that, right? So I would say it does what it intends to set out to do. The last thing I would want to say about Paul's vision of things is that you have to be very careful about dealing with a text like 1 Corinthians 7, which is what you quoted. Because what it actually says is not that the time is short. It says the time has been shortened. And what it does not say is that the distress is imminent. It says the distress is present. He's talking about some kind of present distress that the Corinthians are undergoing, not the eschaton, right? So, I mean, I think one of the real problems in reading Paul is that we haven't exorcised the ghost of Albert Schweitzer's "they thought it was going to happen tomorrow and it didn't, well, darn. Now we have to invent a religion called Christianity," right? I think that's a misreading of Paul as well as of Jesus. And so eschatological, yes. The eschaton is coming definitely tomorrow, no.
Final comment, I guess I was intrigued, and as soon as you said it, I thought, yeah. I mean, it's one can be accused of being a bit grand, but let me use it anyway. Yeah, Caravaggio. As you know, my wife is an art critic and art historian, and so everything I say, I depend upon her. But you know, my understanding is that Caravaggio's distinctive thing was that he didn't just paint commissioned works of the genres that everybody else was commissioned to do, but he did it with a particular distinctive spin. There was a highly interpretive way that he rendered. So you'd say, okay, that's another genre scene of that, and we've got 50 other examples of it. But the Caravaggio one was always distinctive. And I would say there's a Caravaggio tone to the film in that it tells the story of Paul. You recognize the story as you would a Caravaggio painting, but you also recognize a distinctive artistic hand at work in it that is interpreting it. And a person might say, I'm not sure how well that stacks up against the historical record exactly, but it is all the more effective for that. So I would say, yes, it is very good at stimulating discussion and thought. And the things that you've underscored as, I think, relatively uncontroversial points are that, I think.